We're now very excited to invite to speak this Shabbat morning Rob Leikind, who is joining us. And I want to thank Terry for connecting Rob to us. Terry Schwartz-Russell is coordinating many of our Shabbatot speakers, especially over the summer. If you're interested in speaking, please reach out to her. And we're very excited to have Rob with us. He's been director of AJC New England for the past number of years, I think about 13 years. And he is really working with a wonderful team to create a vibrant and strengthen a vibrant AJC New England dedicated to advancing AJC's global program to fight anti-Semitism and other forms of hate, advance democratic values at home and abroad, and ensure a secure and peaceful future for the state of Israel. Rob began his career working with Holocaust survivors in Brooklyn, New York. A lawyer by training, he served as assistant district attorney before going on to be the director of ADL's Connecticut and Boston officers and senior vice president of Hebrew College. It has been wonderful to work with him, as I have, on issues of anti-Israel sentiment and issues dealing with different populations in that area. And it's really wonderful to welcome you here this Shabbat and to hear some of your words about what does anti-Jewishness look like today and how do we see it. Thank you so much, Rob. Let's get you unmuted and you're ready to go. You're still on mute.
Okay, sure, the problem. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. And Rabbi Lerner and Terry, thank you for the invitation. I have to say, it's such a pleasure to participate in your Shabbat service and to share with all of you truly one of the exceptional Jewish communities in Greater Boston. As the title of my remarks indicates, I intend to talk about the emergence of 21st century anti-Semitism and how we do and don't see it. Often when I speak on a Shabbat, I like to try to connect my comments to the Parsha, but when I realized the topic of this week's Parsha, Tazria and Metzora, I kind of lost my nerve. I would have been helped a lot to have heard Rabbi Perkins speak first. How does one connect our modern struggle against anti-Semitism with an ancient narrative that talks about the process of purification necessitated by rashes, menstruation, funguses growing on houses? And I concluded, sensibly, I think, that I shouldn't try. But then I did have one thought, and it actually wasn't my thought. Some scholars I remembered from something I had read years back had argued that the ancient Hebrews were absorbed in the type of rituals described in Tazria and Metzora because they believed that the very survival of the survival of their community depended upon removing impurities from their midst that in their minds were suggestive of death and decay. These impurities, they feared, would cause God, the force of life and goodness, to withdraw from them. And so they developed complex rituals to ensure that no blemish would tarnish their community and God would remain close and among them. In other words, if you buy the hypothesis, Tazria and Metzora are in part the story of an existential struggle faced by early Hebrews who were struggling to sustain the well-being of their community in very challenging times, which is not altogether unlike the circumstances of us in the 21st century. We're struggling to secure our world against a different but also very dangerous threat to our community, anti-Semitism. So with that said, I'm not sure it's the most robust connection between the Parsha and today's talk, but it's what I got. So I'll move on and share with you what I came to discuss. And it begins with a report from the FBI, the most recent report on hate crimes. And it indicated that while Jews constitute less than 2% of the US population, more than 60% of religiously based hate crimes were targeted against Jews. The numbers in Massachusetts were no more reassuring. We're about 3 to 4% of the population in Massachusetts, but 17% of hate crimes in the Commonwealth were directed at Jews, according to data collected by the governor's office. Only African Americans had higher percentage. And when you look at religiously based hate crimes in Massachusetts, fully 70% of those that were recorded were directed against Jews. Last October, AJC commissioned a national survey of Jewish opinion regarding anti-Semitism. And we learned that, striking actually, 37% of American Jews reported that they had been targeted with anti-Semitism in the last 5 years. 24% reported that they avoid wearing anything that will identify themselves as Jewish in public. More than 30% said that they avoid going to places, certain places in public, where they might be identified Jewishly. Not surprisingly, given some of that data, 88% of Jews, according to the survey, reported that, American Jews that is, that they believe that anti-Semitism is a very serious and somewhat serious problem. But then something interesting came up. AJC did a parallel survey of the general public and learned something that was really very surprising. 46% of Americans have never heard of the word anti-Semitism or don't know what it means. In other words, while in the Jewish community, people are increasingly concerned about what they perceive as a proliferation of anti-Semitism, nearly half of our non-Jewish neighbors don't know that a problem exists. It would be a mistake to infer that this means that they're anti-Semitic. It just means that there are things that worry us that aren't entirely visible to others. This points to a phenomena that's not unique in the United States. At the beginning of this century, anti-Semitism began to surge in Europe. Our offices, AJC has offices around the world, and our offices in Europe, particularly in Paris, Berlin, and Brussels, began reaching out intensively to government officials. Where we saw a pattern of activity that was being fueled by strong ideological currents, what we often heard back from government officials we spoke to was that, in fact, these were unconnected incidents rather than a spread of toxic ideas. In fact, they were wrong. There are diverse ideological currents that were emerging. It all shared a central idea, one idea, I should say. Jews are a corrupting force that pose a grave danger to the health and well-being of society. We saw this in the proliferation of right-wing groups that celebrate the Nazi past and were busy reviving anti-Semitic ideologies. We saw this in the integration of virulent anti-Israel ideas, often untethered to any real knowledge, in the left-wing movements that now hold Israel among the most racist, anti-democratic, and totalitarian societies in the world. We saw this in the spread of Islamic extremism that turned violent and against Jews in several European countries. And we've seen this in persistent calls from some religious leaders that have demonized Jews and Judaism. For Jews, the situation became deeply evocative and unsettling. And it's important to note here, you can't understand anti-Semitism just by looking at violent incidents and hate crimes. Anti-Semitism is fundamentally about ideas, conspiracy theories that consistently identify Jews as an immoral force that will bring great harm to society. And gradually, European leaders woke up to what was happening and began taking action. Countries like Germany and France appointed senior government leaders to address the crisis. Laws were passed and statements issued. But it also became evident that in much of Europe, where 2 generations earlier, 6 million Jews had been murdered, people still did not recognize anti-Semitism. This led to AJC working with an international organization that has 33 member states, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, fondly known as IRA, to develop a working definition of anti-Semitism that could help people recognize and understand anti-Semitism. In the space of about 5 years, 29 countries have adopted this definition. Many international bodies have endorsed it. UN Secretary General Guterres has supported it. The Obama, Trump, and now Biden administration has supported it. And perhaps most strikingly, 51 of 53 organizations in the Conference of Presidents of major Jewish organizations also favor it, demonstrating the kind of unanimity that I don't remember another occasion when we saw that. The definition itself is very modest. It says anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish and non-Jewish individuals and/or the property toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. That's the definition, and then there is commentary that follows it, which I'm just going to take a moment to read because I think it probably comes to the nub of what the discussion that is happening today. To guide the IHRA work, the following examples may serve as examples, and there'll be examples. But what it says here, manifestations might include the targeting of the state of Israel, conceived of as a Jewish collectivity. However, criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country cannot be regarded as anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism frequently charges Jews with conspiring to harm humanity, and it is often used to blame Jews for why things go wrong. It is expressed in writing, visual forms, and action. And it goes on a little bit further. The definition then goes into 11 examples. And for example, and I'll give you 3 of them. Calling for aiding or justifying the killing or harming of Jews in the name of a radical ideology or an extremist view of religion could be anti-Semitism. Second, denying the fact, scope, mechanisms such as gas chambers or intentionality of the genocide of the Jewish people at the hands of National Socialist Germany and its supporters could be anti-Semitism. Denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination by claiming the existence of the state of Israel as a racist endeavor could be anti-Semitism. And then there are more of those. Some of the examples, such as the last one I just mentioned, have generated controversy. And the claim is that by bringing Israel into the definition, it will chill criticism of Israel, and some go on to say it'll chill free speech. This claim, I believe, is without any merit. The definition states clearly that the criticism of Israel is not inherently anti-Semitism. It never says more about any of these definitions than that they could be anti-Semitic. As is true with racism and all other forms of bigotry, sometimes we have to have uncomfortable discussions about what is and is not racist, or in this case, anti-Semitism. In a democracy, we don't banish what is true to avoid uncomfortable conversations. We have those conversations. AJC is now committed to ensuring that these conversations happen by promoting the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. We need to make anti-Semitism visible to the non-Jewish public and to many Jews. This is going to be difficult to do. And if there's not a shared understanding and language that helps us recognize anti-Semitic events and actions and words, it'll be very challenging for people to begin to understand it. The great achievement of the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism is that it has achieved wide acceptance, not only in the United States, where we're beginning to sell it across the country, but across Europe. We're on the verge of doing something unprecedented, creating an international consensus about what anti-Semitism looks like and how to think about it. AJC's 24 offices now are working across the United States, are working to advance this consensus in the United States. In New England, we have a 4-part plan, and we'll need your help. First of all, we're getting support from diverse public leaders in this area, people like Deval Patrick or Lee Pelton, business leaders like John Fish, and many others that we have right now. We've started a civic conversation project where we're bringing in leaders from other communities to have a conversation about the issues that are uppermost in their mind, but also engaging them on some of the things we're concerned about, most of all, how to deal with anti-Semitism. And third, we are beginning a process of outreach to municipalities and civic leaders to ask them to consider making use, appropriate use, not legislatively, but as an educational tool in their communities. Finally, in the fall, we're hoping to begin to reach out to you, to synagogues, where you can make use of this tool, we hope, and use it as an educational tool, as a clarifying opportunity. We're hoping that synagogues will adopt the IRA model and convey to others in their community why this is so important. Let me just say a few words in conclusion. 3/4 of a century after the Shoah, Jews in America, notwithstanding emerging anti-Semitism, we've achieved unparalleled acceptance. We are a community that has been brought into the leadership of major corporations. Our members serve in Congress. We have people who are leading universities. We are leaders in the arts. Jews are widely accepted. Anti-Semitism is not a barrier to participation today in mainstream life. It's a threat to Jewish life, nevertheless. When we look at the data that we have, and we see the spread of conspiracy theories that place Jews at their center, we know that we cannot afford, given our history, to be dismissive or indifferent to those facts. Like few prior generations, however, we have the strength and the opportunity to protect ourselves and secure our future. There's no single solution to the emergence of 21st century anti-Semitism. There's no ritual that will solve our deeply historical challenge. But this IRA definition, working definition of anti-Semitism, provides a concrete, practical, and tangible way to secure our future. I'm glad to have this opportunity to talk with you about it, and I'll welcome questions and comments about it later.
Rob. Thank you so much for joining us. And obviously, we have some challenges before us, and we'll continue the conversation as Rob has graciously offered to stay on after the end of services for some Q&A. Although it is BYOK, bring your own Kiddush. You're bringing your own Kiddush. We're ready for Kiddush. And to have Rob join us, let's switch to gallery view so we can all see each other. We're excited for some Q&A. So those who'd like to join us for some question and answer, as we always like to say, make yourselves at home. And we will start with some questions. I'll open up, Rob, if that's okay. I appreciated your talk, although can't say I loved hearing it because of the content was a little bit depressing. But it was good to have those statistics and things that we had experienced anecdotally clearly are based in numbers and in facts. So it was sad, but important to hear that. I'm curious what you think about right-wing extremism, which according to some statistics, Southern Poverty Law Center, are even greater in numbers, coming at us with all kinds of places, QAnon conspiracy theories and what have you. So I'm curious if you could speak to that as an opener, and then we'll invite everyone else to jump in the conversation.
There's a lot to be said. The thing that and first of all, establishing data on right-wing conspiracies is a little bit more complicated, but because you're talking about something it's not just about the data that I was giving you is about demonstrable acts. The horrible terrorist acts that you might see, such as what happened at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, are not necessarily the norm. What you're talking about coming out of the right wing are a whole series of conspiracy theories, which are often untethered from reality, but are rooted in broader conspiracy theories about the nature of the struggles that we're having here in the United States, and for that matter, in Europe. When somebody says that forest fires are being caused by a laser that's being controlled by the Rothschilds in California, you're talking about an idea that once again is putting Jews at the heart of a conspiracy to bring harm to the general community. And those are the things that are proliferating in the right wing. If you look at what happened at the Tree of Life, the perpetrator there believed in a theory that placed Jews at the hub of the whole immigration crisis. Jews were controlling the immigration crisis. Jews were causing the tens of thousands of people to come to the border between Mexico and Texas, and the Jews had to be stopped. Those are the kinds of things that are very, very dangerous when they start to become normative. We have been working very hard now with Facebook, some of the other online groups who are gradually waking up to the fact that that they actually can influence those discussions and how they appear online. We're glad that there's some measures now being taken again regarding Holocaust denial to make it harder for that to travel through Facebook. We're looking forward to seeing similar things happening on Twitter.
Got it. We're going to just pause for a moment to make sure that the breakout rooms are working.
Yes, I think we're missing 3 of our 2552 students. We're missing Jaden Mail, Sarah Pormusa, and I think there was someone else, and Leah Rotman.
Great.
Okay.
So let's slide them and you over. Thank you, Samantha, for that help. And harder to get into the breakout room. I thought it was easier than into the Pius Chapel, but in any case, let's continue the discussion, and I'm looking for people to jump in. We'll start with Tony and then head to An.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction to this terrible topic of anti-Semitism. I was wondering if there are any statistics about the who the people are that are doing these attacks that they have. I mean, I think there are a lot of people doing things that nobody's reporting, but the ones that you have, are there statistics about who these people are and what organizations involved?
There are lots of organizations involved. There are people who are doing, there's a lot of people who are doing research. I don't have data on the character types. A lot of these groups are smaller groups that have been around in different forms for years. The Aryan Nations you've heard of the Aryan Nations. Now you have other groups that have morphed that are ideologically akin.
Like the Proud Boys or something like.
I'm sorry?
Like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. Yeah,
they're variations, but they're ideologically akin very often. The movement in the right wing is fairly fluid. What's different is the acceptance of unhinged narratives. When I say unhinged, I'm saying narratives that are not attached to any demonstrable evidence is become more acceptable recently. And that makes it much easier for some of these narratives to start to travel. And some of the ideas to travel. And that's why we take a look at it, and we really are interested in mobilizing support so that it's identifiable when we see it.
Over to An and then Terry.
Yes. So Rabbi Leonard, you won't be surprised. Hi, Rob, by the way. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you on.
Yeah, so you won't be surprised. As much as I'm worried about the right-wing conspiracy theories, I'm much more worried about what happens on campuses today, which is more left-wing, with Israel being pictured as the capital sin today. The capital sin today in the liberal sphere is racism. And Israel is pictured as the epitome of the racist state. And that has an effect on the way Jews are perceived. If they defend Israel, if they don't defend Israel, they're fine. But if they try to advocate for Israel, they are tagged as racist. And I think it's extremely worrisome because all those universities are training tomorrow's leaders, and they will have grown with this idea that Jews are not victims anymore, that they're perpetrators, that they're racist. And the fact I'm French influences me because in France, the anti-Semitism from left wing and Islamism is much more important than the right wing one. So I know it's different here in the States, but I see how it has evolved in my country. And I'm really worried that your elites today will be deeply anti-Semitic because the way they are trained on campuses today.
First of all, I think what you're raising is a really important point. Thank you, Ann. The difference between right-wing anti-Semitism and left-wing anti-Semitism is that on our end, is that we understand right-wing anti-Semitism. We recognize it when we see it much more easily than left-wing anti-Semitism. What's happening on the left gets into a complicated territory, and it also gets into a discussion about the IRA definition, where some people are critical of it. And Israel today has become the paradigm, as you said, for international racism, colonialism, all the nasty isms that you could apply that describe the behavior of the West through the generations that people are now feeling remorseful about are applied to Israel and on campuses widely. Young Jews today are being screened out of progressive movements, notwithstanding their, and for many, the issue of becoming whether you speak out in favor of Israel really has to do with whether they want to risk being targeted as a racist. It's that blunt. So I think that it's a real issue. I'm not saying that every student, every Jewish student in every campus is living in a state of fear of being found out that they're pro-Israel in some fashion. But I think it's true that progressive movements are beginning to turn away from Jews and from Israel. The question is that anti-Semitism? Is it anti-Semitic to be critical of Israel? And I think the answer should be absolutely not. If that were true, most Israelis would be anti-Semitic, right? And much of our Jewish community would be considered anti-Semitic. I think the boundary line, and this is where some people are critical of the working definition that I described to you, is when this criticism begins to hold Israel to a standard that it doesn't hold other countries to, when this criticism is anchored in ideas that deny Israel's legitimacy and the right of a Jewish state to exist, when we are seeing Israel described in terms which are really not tethered to reality, then a reasonable person might ask, what's motivating the speaker? Is it ignorance? Is it a readiness to believe that Jews are more likely than others to do bad things, so we'll believe this? What is the reason why people are obsessed in certain circles that you described with Israel and really are not particularly interested in what's happening to Uyghurs in China, or Rohingya in Burma, or slaves in Mauritania? And the list goes on and on and on. What makes Israel the natural focal point for this outrage? And it's hard not to begin to ask whether or not anti-Semitism sometimes might have to do with that. The critics of the IRA definition, and I don't actually disagree with it, but I don't think what they're criticizing is evident in the IRA definition, say that what you're doing is attacking evidence-based criticism of Israel. And I think the only thing one would say is Israel should be subject to criticism like any other country. Unfortunately, in many parts of the left, Israel has become a symbol of things that the left objects to. And I'm not speaking for or against those ideas. I'm just simply, and in those instances, there's a legitimate right to inquire about whether or not those ideas are in fact stand on their own 2 feet or reflect a habit of mind that singles out Jewish interests.
Over to Terry.
Hi, Rob. Thanks for
Hi,
coming to
Terry.
Temple Amuna.
No, it's a pleasure.
So I guess my comments are twofold. One is that there's so much hatred going on these days, anti-Asian, anti-Black, that I wonder, how vocal can one be, the Jewish community be about anti-Semitism, because that's not where the focus is right now. And, do we want to draw attention, all that tension of yes, what's right and what's wrong. And the other thing is, I'm assuming, since we've had so much experience with this whole issue, how is I'm assuming that the Jewish community is helping the Black and the Asian communities with their own step forward to combat anti-whichever. And I wanted, so two questions in that respect.
Yeah, so with regard to the idea of helping and involved, listen, the issues concerning the African American community and other people of color, those are American issues. They're particular to people of color. There's a reckoning going on, and those are all our issues. And so, I think that Jewish communal organizations, AJCU included, are trying to find ways to be helpful. So, legislatively, and AJC and other organizations are engaged in some of the discussions there about reforms that need to take place. There's the universe of possibilities is infinite. So I think the answer is yeah. This is a moment in time. This is an historic national conversation that's happening. It's complicated. It's going to get more complicated. And there are going to be some issues that are going to be challenging for the Jewish community that are coming down the pike. But I think fundamentally we need to be there. In terms of, is raising the issue of anti-Semitism playing Me Too? Which in a way I think is what you're asking. And I think it's a fair question. I think we need to handle these questions with care, the way we go about it. But what I can tell you is we're in conversation with various people. People are alert to it. There are lots of people of goodwill, including, by the way, people on the left. There are people that, right? This isn't a left-right thing. I'm just talking about phenomenons that exist in those communities of thought. But we in the Jewish community have authentic concerns. We're not raising them because there are other issues that are out there. And it's our responsibility to present them to people, because otherwise people will not know if we don't. And my experience is there's interest as long as we're sensitive to the politics of the moment.
Thank you. Others who would like to jump in on the
Great
conversation?
question.
Over to Hal.
Yeah, this is a question about organizations. We get about half a dozen correspondences every day in U.S. mail and email and so forth from AJC, ADL, B'nai B'rith, Camera. There are just so many organizations that seem to
You are so fortunate.
that seem to be doing the same thing. And I'm just wondering, is that a good thing? Or just if all were consolidated, would be better? I don't know.
It's a great thing, and sometimes it's not. Look, the opportunities for activism are fairly substantial. What I can say is that in my experience, the differences between the organizations are becoming more clear than was true in the past. And what I can also say locally, at places where our interests overlap, we collaborate very effectively. I can't say that's for the whole country, but I can say that here in New England, in Boston, we collaborate very effectively. Let me just sort of demarcate, without speaking for the other organizations, let me just demarcate what I think are some of the central focal points and points of overlap very quickly. I'll speak for AJC. That's what I'm most comfortably speaking for, but AJC is a global organization. Our great opportunity is that we have a global network we can tie to. So when we talk about anti-Semitism in Europe and anti-Semitism in the United States, we can connect those dots with an email very readily. So we have certain kinds of leverage. We can connect our conversations in Washington, connects to the conversations we're having in Berlin. AJC is the leading civil rights organization in the Jewish, ADL, I said, is the leading civil rights organization. They do great work and very, very important work in that arena. The Jewish Community Relations Council, which is an umbrella for many Jewish organizations, fabulous leader, doing a lot of work connecting our community to other communities in the area as well. ADL does that, so does AJC, but JCRC is amazing, very effective in the legislature, providing great leadership. So you have different organizations. It's not altogether unlike saying, you know, paper towels. Look at all the different kinds of paper towels. They're different. The marketplace also helps organizations do better, but none of us are wanting for enough to do. There's a huge amount to do. In the Jewish community, it's articulated through different organizations. My guess is that's a lot better for us than if we all only had one organization.
Others would like to jump in, over to Maylee and then Sandy.
Hi, thank you so much for coming to Temple Amuna. Really appreciate your perspective and your voice. My question comes out of my experience. I lived in Berlin, Germany for 8.5 years, came back about 3 years ago and had some dealings with AJC there. And I'm curious about how you are seeing the differences between what the local group is doing versus what's going on in Berlin, what they're dealing with there. Thank you.
Well, you spent more time with the people in Berlin than I have. So you might look. It's a great question. So for those of you who are unaware, AJC has 12 overseas offices, 7 of which are in Europe. 1 is in South America. We have 1 in Tokyo, in addition to Jerusalem, in New Delhi, and we're opening 1 up very, very shortly in the United Arab Emirates. Let me start with the UAE one, and I'll take you to Berlin and then to here. We've been active in the Gulf and elsewhere that I can't talk about readily for many, many years. We've been active in the Gulf for at least a quarter of a century, building some of the relationships which contributed to the ultimately the Abraham Accords. And that's why we're moving so quickly, having an office introduced there. AJC operates functionally overseas as a diplomatic arm. We have extensive relationships with German leadership, with the Bundestag, with the German Jewish community. I assume you got to know Deirdre Berger in your time, yeah. And very special, very special.
She came to our synagogue there a number of times, absolutely.
Yeah, and so, you know, we have the opportunity to exercise a certain amount of influence in ways that would be surprising because we are an American Jewish organization. And people care about what American Jews think. They care about what Americans think. And within that ecosystem, Jews are part of what they care about. So we're in a position to, the functions of our offices overseas are heavily diplomatic, and dealing with the idea leaders in civil society. Our role here is different. Our role here is to represent the interests of the American Jewish community, in this case, in New England. So that means a range of things, from intergroup work that we do, Last week, we had an op-ed in the Globe that I did together with an African-American leader to talk about what's happening in the Asian community and how it connects to the experience of African-Americans and Jews. That's a piece of the work we do. We're involved in the legislature. We're involved in advocacy on a range of issues, some of which I've had the pleasure of working with Rabbi Lerner on. So our work here is much more local, but I also talk with all the diplomatic corps here as a way of advancing some of the work that's happening overseas. I hope that answered it. Are there other questions?
Rob, it's Sandy Miller Jacobs. Good to see you again.
Yeah, nice to see you.
I just want to say we are really lucky and thankful that you're here working on our behalf, because you're thoughtful and you're concerned and you're articulate and you're very well organized and you really know this stuff. It's just great to really hear you speaking about it all.
Oh, it's so nice of you to say.
I'd like to listen to, but
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. Are there any other questions people have?
I had a simple question, and that I think it's a simple question. You always spoke about AJC, but you never said what it stands for. Maybe I missed it as you were going through.
Thank you. AJC my apologies. AJC stands for the American Jewish Committee. I should probably stand there. American Jewish Committee is, we've been around for 115 years, 16 years now. We were really among the first of the self-help organizations to be established here in the United States before the NAACP, before the ADL. We quickly became involved in the civil rights movement. We played a role, a modest but important role in the development of the human rights, international human rights conventions. We were one of the chief organizers of King's March on Washington. AJC for many years before it really developed its global footprint, also operated as something of a think tank and played a central role in creating the intellectual foundations for thinking about our country as a multicultural as opposed to a white Christian society. It really pioneered in the interfaith world. Today, AJC is, to give you a sense of AJC's reach, first, kippah-wearing Israeli to go to Saudi Arabia with an Israeli passport was the head of our international interfaith work, who has been active there in Saudi Arabia and others. It was part of the diplomacy of opening up Saudi Arabia. AJC works quietly, but we, as Teddy Roosevelt said, walk softly but carry a big stick, and we think we do that well.
The reason I asked is because I knew that I thought it was American Jewish Committee, but the fact that you didn't say it and then you spoke about how global it was, that's why I wanted to ask.
I appreciate it, and I need to remind myself to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Others who wish to ask a question, or I have one if no one else wants to jump in. I'd like to talk about alliances. One of the work that some of the work I've been involved in is trying to build bridges between different communities, the Muslim and the Jewish community, other communities. And I've always seen that as not only important on its own, but also as one of the hopefully guarantors of a deep relationship so that we protect each other when there's times of need. I was wondering if AJC works in that area, how you view that, and how you understand that type of work.
Yeah, a lot of what we do, just by definition, we functionally, we tend to operate less in the headlines and more diplomatically. It's all about building connections and facilitating conversation, whether we're doing it with diplomats or others. Our style is to talk to people who don't necessarily see the world the way we do. just on a national level. So when we talk about the work we're doing around the world, that's what it is. We're now actively engaged in Indonesia, largest Muslim country in the world. That's the reason why the head of the largest Muslim organization in Indonesia came to Israel under AJC auspices, heavily criticized for doing it, but he stands by it. He's a friend, and others are following. So that kind of bridge building is what we do. But here domestically, we're one of the organizers of the Black Jewish Caucus in Congress. We have worked very closely with the Hellenic Jewish Caucus in Congress. Again, we helped organize that. We are doing extensive work with Latino leaders. We are engaging, as I told you, the Civic Conversations Project we're developing. We just started, or actually we're just in conversations, and it seems we've come to an understanding with a Muslim women's group that will connect with a AJC women's group to do joint advocacy on hate crimes related bills that are now under consideration in Congress and here in the local, in the Massachusetts legislature. So we're trying to find these kinds of connections. Sometimes it's more difficult than at other times. The issues are difficult. As you know, there's some places where you sometimes have to say, you know, we're not going to have an alliance here. We're going to actually disagree on something. And you have to do that too. But I think that there's a tension in Jewish advocacy between the two types of advocacy. But on balance, you want to keep talking to people if you can.
That's for sure. Others for some final thoughts and comments?
I guess it's Terry again. I just would ask, how do you get involved with AJC? I mean, that panel of women sounds fascinating. Just as an example.
It does sound fascinating. Terry, send me an email. It's that easy.
Great. And I think we can certainly put out other messages to the community of programs you're involved in and put them out on our own listserv so people are aware of that and can get involved. I wanted to close just with a final follow-up, which is kind of based on the question that Ann asked. What do you, I mean, I see this as a particular challenge with my own daughter in college and another one heading off in another year to school. But what are the ideas that are out there to help us, you know, in the school, in the thought and idea realm that will help us position Israel and Jews differently? I always thought we were at the leaders of like every movement, Save Darfur, you know, Bosnian Muslim refugees, you name it. Like we've been at the head, and then it's like all that's forgotten, and we're now, you know, not in that position, even though we do lead there.
So let me offer, I think, 3 points. One is you have to start educating young people before they go to school. We've started a program here called Leadership for Tomorrow. We, unfortunately, it's small. We are taking now 25 teens, 11th and 12th graders, and they're going through a 6-month training program. Some of those teens, when they go off to college, are staying in contact with us, and we're trying to build a network to support them. And part of it is students that don't have strong Jewish identities and recognize the danger of being pro-Israel. And when I say pro-Israel, I'm not posing a particular philosophy of what that means. I'm just saying lovers of Zion. If you don't have that basic feeling, then you're going to be much less inclined to sort of put your head out and sort of say, Israel is good, I'm going to defend it. There has to be something inside of you tells you. And so in the program that we do, some of the kids have great Jewish education, some of them are very secular, But we always start with, what's your point of access to being Jewish? What's your point of connection? What is it? And we want them to learn how to talk about it, and feel it and represent it with confidence. So I think that before you get to college, you have to educate them. Look, I think in some campuses, there's some really strong headwinds. And for Hillel, it gets really, really difficult because they are representing students who have very, very diverse student beliefs. And so if Hillel takes a particular position on a campus dispute, they're at risk of alienating part of their communities. There are different kinds of problems. There are problems where there's outright abuse. There was a situation on a campus in upstate New York 2 weeks ago. You're aware of it. And it doesn't matter, Skidmore. And what happened there was extraordinary. And the position of the administration initially was, student governments get to choose what they do with their money. In this instance, because a group of students wanted to create a progressive Zionist group, a student Senate committee basically said, we don't need progressive Zionists. They already have their voice. We want more Palestinian voice. If you want to have a club, bring out a Palestinian co-chair. Crazy. Those are the kinds of things that are demonstrable. You can fight those. You can fight those, and you can win. What's more difficult is an insidious ideology, which normatively we would look at and say it's anti-Semitism. What is an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory? It's something that places Jews uniquely at the center of evil conduct. What's happening in campus is, it's not that we are concerned about totalitarianism all over the place, and we think that Israel is a totalitarian society, and we're concerned about the Uyghurs and all these things. No, it's just Israel. That process of demonizing does follow the historical trend lines of classical anti-Semitism. But there are two important distinctions. Number one is there are many people that may have views like that actually are quite informed. And maybe it is a political belief. Maybe it's not anti-Semitism. That's also possible. We have to make that distinction, and it's difficult. Number one. Number two, many people hold these beliefs because it's fashionable. When I was a kid, it was fashionable to wear bell bottoms. Some of you remember that. It was a fashion. And dinging Israel is a fashion today, but it's a pernicious fashion because of the history it is. And I think some of us should be asking ourselves a more difficult question, is whether the disposition to focus on Israel isn't somewhat rooted to the notion, deeply embedded notion in Western thought, that Jewishness is in some way tied to evil. An idea that was derivative of Christian teachings for centuries, that was adopted by elements of the Western philosophical tradition, and that it would be surprising if it had disappeared, even if the language of today is one of tolerance. And so I think I don't have a single answer to what's happening, except that where I finished my comments, we can't afford to be glib about what's happening. They're difficult discussions, and they're going to continue.
Well, I want to thank you for your work and coming today. If I think of one of the roots, it's got to be in the fact that we have lost a lot of Holocaust education. It used to be that every middle school student read Night. That was part of the education. And when you cited that 46% statistic, I can't help but think that there's been a loss of some common Holocaust education, and that we've no longer been included in the group of potential people who are hated. And so I think there has to be some work on the educational level that might be one of the strategies that we should look at as a Jewish community.
If I may, Rabbi, apropos of that, and really for everybody listening, There is a bill in the legislature right now here in Massachusetts supporting Holocaust education. It has had difficulty getting passed. It's up again now. I'm going to be meeting with the governor to urge him to sign it if it gets to his desk. Each of you should write a letter to your state senator and state legislator. You can, it's very easy to find out who they are. I'm sure, Robert Lerner, you can help everybody with that. And write a letter and just say, this bill needs to be passed. It's a small thing, but I will tell you, the legislators respond to the people they hear from. And if they hear from you, it will be a few votes closer to getting this thing passed.
Thank you for that. Great suggestion.
Thank you.
And I don't know, does JCRC have a campaign for that already?
ADL is the lead on this one. You've asked about, so earlier we asked about, do we cooperate? ADL is the lead on this one. JCRC and AJC are supporting.
Good. Well, that gives us a concrete goal, which is very helpful. Thank you so much for joining us. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom. And